Hello and welcome to Tumbuh. You are in for a treat today. Today I am sitting down with Dr. Jessie Jarvis. She is the Assistant Professor of Marine Biology at UNC Wilmington and also the President of the World Seagrass Association. Jessie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be talking with you.
Yeah, Jessie, as you know, we have a very exciting odyssey to the Galapagos Islands coming up. And as part of preparation for that, our 21 global travelers have been doing readings and research, learning all about the climate and the ecosystems. And I recently ran across an article about seagrass in the Galapagos. And I thought, wait a minute, I know an expert in that field. I'm calling Jessie. So, Jessie, tell us, what is seagrass? What really is seagrass?
All right, so seagrass, I think, is the coolest plant or types of plants on the planet. Seagrasses are underwater flowering plants. They're the only plants that actually flower in the ocean.
So is it seaweed?
No, it is definitely not seaweed, and It's also not like the salt marsh plants. So people sometimes go to the coast, especially areas that have salt marshes, and they're like, oh, look at these cool seagrasses. And no, those are actually marsh plants. So seagrasses live their entire lives underwater, kind of like seaweed. What makes them different from seaweed is they actually have roots. So they're like typical plants you see in your yard, but they just live in salt water.
Oh, very cool. So for the everyday person who isn't overly knowledgeable about this, how would we tell the difference? Would it be an actual flower? How would we tell the difference under the water?
Right. So like plants on land, they only flower during certain times of the year. So you might not see a flower when you guys are visiting the Galapagos or if you're out looking in the coast in your areas. Typically, the best way to look to tell the difference between seagrass or macroalgae or seaweed is that you actually can maybe pick it up, dig it up out of the ground. And for seaweeds, they will have a sort of hold fast. So it looks like sort of almost like the same part of the blade. It looks like a mini root, but it's not a true root. So it's more fleshy. If you bring up a seagrass, you'll see like a root structure. So you'll bring it up and it'll actually have roots on the bottom. So that's how you can tell the difference there. What's interesting is that they're actually not grasses. So we call them seagrasses because they look like seagrasses, but they're more closely related to lilies than anything else.
How cool. Lilies under the water. I like that.
Yeah.
So Jessie, as long as I've known you, which is a long time, you have been so passionate about seagrass and just the health of our waterways. Tell me, where did that come from for you?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay region, so east coast of the U.S., and it's our largest estuary. And so going to school, they used to tell us all the time, we got to take these amazing trips out to look at the water and the coast. And then in the 90s, because we're old, Lindsay, in the 90s, there was a big sort of downturn for the health of the Chesapeake Bay. Okay. And we were watching some videos on it in class about all the sort of problems that were happening and the nutrient pollution and the development. And then it was all very depressing. And they got to the end of the video and they were talking about submerged plants and seagrasses. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of clicked like, oh, I can do that. And so I sort of got hooked on that idea that this was the one optimistic part of the story, that seagrasses might be able to come back and help the bay. And ever since then, that's sort of been something that I've been really passionate about, because I feel like that's a good starting point to help cover some of our coasts.
You were like, I can be a helper. I can make this happen. I'm going to go be a brilliant scientist. I love that. That's great. So, okay, Jessie, I was doing some research on you, even though I know you personally. I don't know you professionally in a lot of ways. So I was doing some research on you, and I love that people characterize you as a coastal plant ecologist. I think that's so cool. I love what that shows me, that tells me about you. But I also noticed in a lot of your writings and things that describe the work that you do, you're really passionate about the effects of environmental stressors on seagrass production, the health of seagrass. Tell me, what are some of the environmental stressors that you're seeing in the seagrasses you've seen all over the world, because you've lived all over the world?
Right, yeah, so I have been able to work with seagrasses in many different types of environments. So in our sort of temperate or cooler areas, I've been working with seagrasses there. And then also in tropical areas, some of the seagrasses in the Great Barrier Reef, I got to work with those for a few years. What's interesting is that while every region has different stressors, there's some big ones that are pretty common around the globe. So with seagrasses, when they get stressed, they can't move, right? So we actually call them the canaries of the coal mine of the ocean, so the canaries of the coastal zone. Because if there is a stressor, if you have fish or turtles or mammals or sharks, they can move, right? They'll go away from the stress, hopefully, if it's not too big of an area, but plants can't. And so they have to deal with it. And so if you start to lose your seagrass, that's a good indication that something has gone really bad in that area, and we need to figure out what it is. So for seagrasses, they are plants, so they need the basic things that plants need, including light. And as light goes through the water column, it very quickly, the amount of light gets lower and lower and lower. And because these plants are living in stressful saltwater, they actually need more light than the plants on land. So they need more light, and they're living in a low light environment. Right?
Oh, goodness.
So anything that would lower light. So if you are dredging to maintain a waterway, if they're dredging to get that will put a bunch of dirt in the water column or sediment, and that can block light. If people are putting too many nutrients like on their lawns, or if they have fish farms, or if they have other agricultural farms, that can cause a lot of nutrients to go in the water, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and your other marine plants, like your other marine photosynthesizers, like your plankton, big algae blooms can form if there's too many nutrients, and that can also block light. So we have a lot of issues with things that block light. And when I was working in Australia, we would work directly with the ports so that they could make sure that they were timing any dredging that they were doing or any kind of shipping activity, that if it was causing any low light events, we could actually go and make sure that they stopped that until the seagrasses could recover. So we were actually working with that. That's one big thing. Coastal development is another definite issue that affects all sorts of marine ecosystems. And so actually what's interesting with seagrasses is that they do much better when they're tied with another ecosystem. So like, for example, mangroves and seagrasses, when they're found next to each other, they're both much more productive. So they do their job, so they're doing in the environment to a much higher level if they're found near each other, right?
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, so if you lose something, like if you cut down your mangroves to put in either for like land or to put in fish farms or shrimp farms, that's going to cause more runoff. You're going to get more sediment, you're going to get more chemicals, and it's going to affect seagrasses as well. So the coastal development is a big issue. Climate change, I mean, that's sort of ubiquitous. It's affecting everything. So there's some thoughts out there that seagrasses will actually be almost a winner because there's more CO2 in the water. But that seems to be offset by other negative things. So when you have a big temperature change, that can actually cause some seagrasses to die back. So here in North Carolina, what I look at are the impacts of temperature and how it interacts with our big seagrass species or eelgrass. Because we're at the southern limit, so anytime you increase temperature just a little bit, you can get a die-off of seagrass. And when seagrass dies off, the jobs that it does actually goes down very quickly. So seagrasses are important for habitat and fisheries. So and it's interesting, when I was in Thailand a couple years ago, we had this massive seagrass flat, and people were out there gleaning. So they were out there just collecting. They had a really cool method where they would take a little stick and they'd put like some sort of sodium bicarbonate on it, just a little bubbler, and they'd stick it in, and they had little holes and little clams like clap onto it, and they'd pull it out. So there's all these people that were feeding themselves and selling clams for folks that were like relying on these seagrass meadows. And so so there's this huge fishery there that it's not just, we tend to think of it as like, well, fish like it, but humans need it too. There's a lot of areas that really rely on seagrass. So it's important to keep them and then healthy, and there's lots of ways that they are declining. Overall, the global population is declining about a median of about 7% of the entire population globally per year.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a lot of seagrass.
So Jessie, when I think of just grass on land, I think, we have some, we don't have some. Some people's yard, they want it, they don't mow theirs, they do, we don't give grass on land a lot of thought. But the longer I hear you talk, I'm like, okay, grass under the water, seagrass, that's actually not grass, seems really, really important to the whole ecosystem. Tell me about that. Like, I hear you saying it's the canary in the coal mine, but just even the health of it alone, how integral is it to our just overall global health when it comes to the health of the planet?
It's a really important part of global health. For one thing, seagrasses, they take CO2, right? So they suck carbon out of the water and they bury it. There's some seagrasses, like in the Mediterranean, there's a species of Posidonia that is over 100,000 years old. It's a clone that's lived for a hugely long time. And when it actually way it's able to do that is it just buries this carbon and makes a really big underground root system. So that carbon is now sequestered. We call it sequestered. Basically, it's taken out of the atmosphere and it's buried. And so it's not going to affect climate change. So there's some debate about how efficient different species of seagrass are with that, but they all bury carbon to some extent. So they're all helping reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, which is important. They're really important for fisheries habitat. So a lot of people who live near the coast rely on fisheries habitat, either for themselves to sustain their families or to bring in an income. And so they provide habitat in nursery areas for a lot of economically important commercial and recreational fishery species. And so they've done studies here in the States and other areas where if you lose the seagrasses, even if you were able to get them back, so if you're able to like bring them back in and do some sort of restoration, it still takes about 4 to 5 years for them to actually be able to get back to where they were being as productive as they were previously. And so during that whole time, once you've lost the grass, and then even once it's recovered, you're losing economic value for that. So they have a big impact for those parts of the system. A recent study, actually this is my favorite ones, when a recent study found that in places where people live, like so if you're like living in a fishing village right on the water and have like fishing pins right in front of you, one of the great things that seagrasses do is actually help remove pathogens that are harmful to human health. So that's not something we see everywhere, but if you have a high density of people and they're living in sort of like right near the water, areas that have seagrasses were healthier for people to swim in than areas where there weren't. So there's lots of things. I could talk about that for hours. Seagrasses do a lot of amazing things.
I know you could. One day we're going to do that. That's incredible though, that, you know, this thing that so many of us don't even know exists, really. We just say, oh, there's seaweed, there's things that are creepy crawly under the water, right, in the ocean, and in different waterways, actually is just this really important fabric that keeps the water healthy, keeps us healthy, and you know, we're contributing to these environmental stressors on that. And that really brings me back to the article, Jessie. It talked about another threat that these seagrasses, specifically in the Galapagos, are experiencing. Can you tell me more about what that threat is?
Yeah, so the article that I think you shared with your travelers talked about one of the, I guess, more shocking studies that have come out of the Galapagos in the last year, where they actually looked to see how many invasive species there are in the Galapagos. So all species have a place where they live, right? That's called their distribution, their geographic distribution. And species move, but typically they're within a certain range. The Galapagos, one of the things that makes it an amazing place on the planet is it has a lot of endemic species, which means that it has a lot of species that are only found there. Okay, so you cannot find them anywhere else, which is really, really cool. So cool. One of the problems, though, is that species, as we have become more global travelers ourselves, humans, we move species when we move. So we've been doing this for as long as we've been traveling the oceans. And what actually happens is sometimes we'll take species with us that we didn't know we were carrying with us and go to a new area, and then it is now distributed to a new place. A lot of times, especially in the Galapagos, they have a lot of species now that have been distributed there because of ships. So it can be things like someone puts an anchor out and they pull it up out of the ground and there's something attached to it. You just don't see it. It's very small. And then you go put the anchor out at a new spot and that species is now released and they can get established. Yeah. So that's one of the big ways that you can spread and alien or invasive species. The problem with these species is that when they get to a new area, they're typically, if they can get established, there's not a natural control. So there's not a predator or there's not something that's going to slow their population growth. And so they can start to outcompete the native species. so they're better at using the resources that are there than the native species,
Mm-hmm.
and that can result in a decline of native species. So a good way with islands, a lot of times you'll hear about snakes that have been introduced. That'll kill bird populations. So we've lost a lot of bird species that way. The Hawaiian Islands have that problem in particular. In the Galapagos with the seagrasses, there are 4 species of seagrass there, and they are, I think majority of them were actually pretty stable. One was threatened on the IUCN red list, but the majority are doing pretty good. The problem is that there is now this invasive bryozoan. So sometimes you'll hear bryozoans called moss animals.
Okay.
But they can look like sometimes it looks like fish eggs. It can be very different looking organisms. They're invertebrates, right? So they don't have a backbone, and they have very jelly-like consistency, and they filter feed. So they're not attacking anything. What they do is they overgrow things. And so what's happening is that they're overgrowing the seagrass meadows. And when they block out that light that seagrasses need,
it's the kudzu of the ocean.
Kind of like that. Maybe they're animals. They're just like animals we don't know anything about.
Wow. So it's blocking the light. They just literally can't get what they need to survive. Wow.
So they start growing on top of the blades as just sort of a structure to adhere to, and then block out the light and the grass dies.
Wow, it's amazing that something so small and kind of unseen by so many of us can have this detrimental effect in such a unique part of the world that then has this ripple effect to the other parts, animals that feed and what have you. Wow. That's really fascinating. And something for our global travelers to think about. We're trying to do small things to offset our carbon footprint as we go, but then there's these other things as we think about packing and what we bring with us and what we don't see, small bugs in our bag or what have you, that can have these detrimental effects. That there's so many things to consider when we think about protecting our planet or just trying to, do no harm as we go from place to place. Wow.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's really fascinating. Well, Jessie, I could go on and on with you about this. I've always loved your deep held calling to the ocean, specifically to the seagrass, but to hear you talk about it and your expertise and your long studied education in it really just comes out in everything that you share. And so we have so much to continue to learn from folks like yourself about how to care for our oceans. So that leads me to my last question. What can the average everyday person do to try to help?
Yeah, it can seem overwhelming. Oceans are a big place, right? So there's a lot going on. Basically, I think a lot of what you guys have already been talking about, because you talked a little bit about some of your curriculum with me. A lot of things you guys are already doing are great. Anything you can do to reduce your plastic use. We just found plastic in the bottom of the Marianas Trench, the deepest place in the ocean has plastic. There's plastic in the snow in Antarctica, right? So anything we can do to reduce our plastic use is great. And at home, anywhere you are, even if you don't live at the coast, you live somewhere where water drains and eventually ends up at the coast. So if you can not apply fertilizer during certain times of the year, that can have a big impact. That'll reduce the amount of nutrients that goes in the waterways, and then that actually helps protect the oceans. If you can, one of the things I'm actually hoping you guys can do as citizen scientists, maybe with the trip, is actually help us get more data about the oceans. It's a really big place. It's very hard for us to get data about where things are. And with seagrasses, we have the added sort of hurdle of they live under the water. Right? So we don't actually know where they are. There's this huge meadow of seagrass in the Indian Ocean that we just found, 6 months ago. I had no idea it was there. It's this huge patch because we just didn't think it could live there, and we didn't have the technology to find it. So one of the things we're doing in this great group called Seagrass Watch is they're actually using citizen scientists to help us identify seagrass species and actually get locations for them. So there's an app that I'm going to send you a link for. You can send to your travelers. And if anybody has just a smartphone, all you have to do is take a picture, say, I think this is a seagrass, and they'll geo-reference your location, and then they can actually identify it for you. So you don't have to know what it is. And they get pictures of all sorts of stuff that aren't seagrass, and it's actually helpful. But what they do is they'll keep the seagrass ones, and then they can help us figure out where seagrasses are, because we can't protect them if we don't know where they are. So if you can help us get some data, that would be great.
I think that's awesome. There's going to be a link at the end of this video for everybody to participate in this. I think this is wonderful. We can, at the very least, we can help those who know what they're doing find this stuff, and we can absolutely commit to thinking more consciously about the plastic usage, the runoff, and the things that we know are ending up in the ocean. But how fun to be considered a citizen scientist. I love that terminology. So Jessie, you have challenged us today to be just that. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the work that you do. We are grateful, and the very least, we will join you in the attempt in being good citizen scientists. So thank you so much for your time, Jessie.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. It's been a lot of fun.